During my childhood, my family was like a drop of water in a vast river, never remaining in one location for long. We settled in Rhode Island when I was 8, and there we remained until I went to college in Colorado Springs. Most of my memories are rooted in Rhode Island, but there are fragments in the attic of my brain which belong to the various homes we had lived in when I was much younger. Most of these memories are unclear and pointless. Chasing after another boy in the backyard of a house in North Carolina, trying to build a raft to float on the creek behind the apartment we rented in Pennsylvania, and so on. But there is one set of memories which remains as clear as glass, as though they were just made yesterday. I often wonder whether these memories are simply lucid dreams produced by the long sickness I experienced that spring. But in my heart, I know they are real. We were living in a house just outside the bustling metropolis of New Vineyard, Maine, population 643. It was a large structure, especially for a family of 3. There were a number of rooms that I didn't see in the 5 months we resided there. In some ways it was a waste of space, but it was the only house on the market at the time, at least within an hour's commute to my father's place of work. The day after my 5th birthday, attended by my parents alone, I came down with a fever. The doctor said I had mononucleosis, which meant no rough play and more fever for at least another 3 weeks. It was horrible timing to be bedridden. We were in the process of packing our things to move to Pennsylvania, and most of my things were already packed away in boxes, leaving my room barren. My mother brought me ginger ale and books several times a day, and these served the function of being my primary form of entertainment for the next few weeks. Boredom always loomed just around the corner, waiting to rear its ugly head and compound my misery. I don't exactly recall how I met Mr. Widemouth. I think it was about a week after I was diagnosed with mono. My first memory of the small creature was asking him if he had a name. He told me to call him Mr. Widemouth because his mouth was large. In fact, everything about him was large in comparison to his body, his head, his eyes, his crooked ears, but his mouth was by far the largest. "You look kind of like a Furby," I said as he flipped through one of my books. Mr. Widemouth stopped and gave me a puzzled look. "Furby? What's a Furby?" he asked. I shrugged. "You know, the toy, the little robot with the big ears. You can pet and feed them, almost like a real pet." "Oh," Mr. Widemouth resumed his activity. "You don't need one of those. They aren't the same as having a real friend." I remember Mr. Widemouth disappearing every time my mother stopped by to check in on me. "I lay under your bed," he later explained. "I don't want your parents to see me because I'm afraid they won't let us play anymore." We didn't do much during those first few days. Mr. Widemouth just looked at my books, fascinated by the stories and pictures they contained. The 3rd or 4th morning after I met him, he greeted me with a large smile on his face. "I have a new game we can play," he said. "We have to wait until after your mother comes to check on you because she can't see us play it. It's a secret game." After my mother delivered more books and soda at the usual time, Mr. Widemouth slipped out from under the bed and tugged my hand. "We have to go to the room at the end of this hallway," he said. I objected at first, as my parents had forbidden me to leave my bed without their permission, but Mr. Widemouth persisted until I gave in. The room in question had no furniture or wallpaper. Its only distinguishing feature was a window opposite the doorway. Mr. Widemouth darted across the room and gave the window a firm push, flinging it open. He then beckoned me to look out at the ground below. We were on the 2nd story of the house, but it was on a hill, and from this angle the drop was farther than 2 stories due to the incline. "I like to play pretend up here," Mr. Widemouth explained. "I pretend that there is a big soft trampoline below this window and I jump. If you pretend hard enough, you bounce back up like a feather. I want you to try." I was a 5-year-old with a fever, so only a hint of skepticism darted through my thoughts as I looked down and considered the possibility. "It's a long drop," I said, "but that's all a part of the fun. It wouldn't be fun if it was only a short drop." If it were that way, you may as well just bounce on a real trampoline. I toyed with the idea, picturing myself falling through thin air only to bounce back to the window on something unseen by human eyes. But the realist in me prevailed. Maybe some other time, I said. I don't know if I have enough imagination. I could get hurt. Mr. Widemouth's face contorted into a snarl, but only for a moment. Anger gave way to disappointment. If you say so, he said. He spent the rest of the day under my bed, quiet as a mouse. The following morning, Mr. Widemouth arrived holding a small box. I want to teach you how to juggle, he said. Here are some things you can use to practice before I start giving you lessons. I looked in the box. It was full of knives. My parents will kill me, I shouted, horrified that Mr. Widemouth had brought knives into my room, objects that my parents would never allow me to touch. I'll be spanked and grounded for a year, Mr. Widemouth frowned. It's fun to juggle with these. I want you to try it. I pushed the box away. I can't. I'll get in trouble. Knives aren't safe to just throw in the air. Mr. Widemouth's frown deepened into a scowl. He took the box of knives and slid under my bed, remaining there the rest of the day. I began to wonder how often he was under me. I started having trouble sleeping after that. Mr. Widemouth often woke me up at night saying he put a real trampoline under the window, a big one that I couldn't see in the dark. I always declined and tried to go back to sleep, but Mr. Widemouth persisted. Sometimes he stayed by my side until early in the morning, encouraging me to jump. He wasn't so fun to play with anymore. My mother came to me one morning and told me I had her permission to walk around outside. She thought the fresh air would be good for me, especially after being confined to my room for so long. Ecstatic, I put on my sneakers and trotted out to the back porch, yearning for the feeling of sun on my face. Mr. Widemouth was waiting for me. I have something I want you to see, he said. I must have given him a weird look because he then said, It's safe, I promise. I followed him to the beginning of a deer trail which ran through the woods behind the house. This is an important path, he explained. I've had a lot of friends about your age. When they were ready, I took them down this path to a special place. You aren't ready yet, but one day I hope to take you there. I returned to the house, wondering what kind of place lay beyond that trail. 2 weeks after I met Mr. Widemouth, the last load of our things had been packed into a moving truck. I would be in the cab of that truck, sitting next to my father for the long drive to Pennsylvania. I considered telling Mr. Widemouth that I would be leaving, but even at 5 years old, I was beginning to suspect that perhaps the creature's intentions were not to my benefit, despite what he said otherwise. For this reason, I decided to keep my departure a secret. My father and I were in the truck at 4 a.m. He was hoping to make it to Pennsylvania by lunchtime tomorrow with the help of an endless supply of coffee and a 6-pack of energy drinks. He seemed more like a man who was about to run a marathon, rather than one who was about to spend 2 days sitting still. Early enough for you? He asked. I nodded and placed my head against the window, hoping for some sleep before the sun came up. I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. This is the last move, son, I promise. I know it's hard for you, as sick as you've been. Once Daddy gets promoted, we can settle down and you can make friends. I opened my eyes as we backed out of the driveway. I saw Mr. Widemouth's silhouette in my bedroom window. He stood motionless until the truck was about to turn onto the main road. He gave a pitiful little wave goodbye, steak knife in hand. I didn't wave back. Years later, I returned to New Vineyard. The piece of land our house stood upon was empty except for the foundation, as the house burned down a few years after my family left. Out of curiosity, I followed the deer trail that Mr. Widemouth had shown me. Part of me expected him to jump out from behind a tree and scare the living bejesus out of me. But I felt that Mr. Widemouth was gone, somehow tied to the house that no longer existed. The trail ended at the New Vineyard Memorial Cemetery. I noticed that many of the tombstones belonged to children. the summer of 1942, as a pigtailed girl of 11, I stood gazing up at the spacious Queen Anne with awe. I had spent the first part of my life in a large city, and this hilltop house looked like a castle. It had everything a young tomboy could want: more than 8 acres of woods and orchard, 250 feet of private lakefront, and that amazing house with its wraparound porch, a wood stove in the kitchen, and best of all, a tower. I had been promised the tower bedroom with its view of the lake. We set about refurbishing the house with enthusiasm. My life was as perfect as I could wish. I liked my new school, made friends, swam, hunted, fished, and prowled the woods. I constructed a treehouse in the orchard where I spent many hours munching on apples and pears while I read. I can't recall exactly how long we lived in the house before he began to make his presence known. From my room I would hear someone walking in the attic. At first I assumed it was my mother, but I always found her in the kitchen or garden, denying she had been upstairs. Then one night I was awakened by a sensation of being watched. I opened my eyes to see an ominous figure looming over me, completely in black. He wore a tall hat and a cape or cloak that he held over the lower part of his face. Above high, hollow cheekbones, sunken red eyes glowered. I screamed for my father, and when he entered the room, the apparition vanished. The manifestations became more frequent, and my visitor became more visible and clearly defined. In warm weather, I began dragging blanket and pillow out my window to sleep on the little mop porch outside my room. In winter, on weeknights when my father was in the city, I would feign cold and beg to sleep with my mother. On weekends, I would again scream for my father. The apparition never appeared in any room but mine, but sometimes I could hear his heavy footsteps in the attic, especially if I was alone in the house. I made it a practice never to be alone in the house after dark. If my mother was out, I bundled up my homework and went next door, where a kind, childless couple always welcomed my company, or I sat on the porch until her return. I only saw the last of him when I grew up and left that house for good. Many years later, my parents came to visit me, and we were looking through some old photo albums. There, in a picture of our old home, peering from the window of my tower bedroom, was his face. My mother said it was only the reflection of tree branches. 2 other snapshots taken at the same time from the exact same location showed only an empty window. When I had the photo enlarged, the darkroom technician refused to make more than 1 print, saying he felt uneasy working with it. I hadn't discussed the apparition with him. My mother then admitted that our home was supposedly haunted. She hadn't wanted to upset me while we were living in the house because, she said, "You were such a nervous child." The ghost was rumored to be a judge who had either shot or hanged himself in the attic. In the summer of 1996, I stood gazing up at the house once more. It had been let go, as they say, but now had new owners who wanted my advice on restoring it. They were full of plans to strip paint from the golden oak woodwork, remove cheap paneling from the walls, and revitalize the gardens. The husband greeted me outside with a warm hug, then looked a bit uncomfortable. He asked if I would mind answering a rather odd question before we went into the house where his wife and children awaited us. "My children believe they have seen a ghost in the tower bedroom," he said. "Is there a ghost in the house?" My answer was, "Yes." As my parents announced their evening plans, I knew I would be left alone for a few hours. Despite being accustomed to solitude, the prospect of spending the evening alone in our old creaky house wasn't exactly thrilling. Once they left, I settled into the living room, the comforting glow of the TV providing some solace. But soon the tranquility shattered when I heard a series of loud bangs echoing from upstairs. Startled, I muted the TV and strained to listen, hoping it was just my imagination. With a sense of trepidation, I tiptoed up the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. As I reached the top, the silence was deafening. I hesitated for a moment, then mustered the courage to check each room, my heart pounding in my chest with each creak of the floorboards. To my relief, there was no one to be found. Yet the eerie feeling persisted as I made my way back downstairs. As I resumed watching TV, the room was suddenly plunged into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. That's when I heard faint footsteps from upstairs. My mind raced with fear as I gripped my phone tightly. I quickly dialed 911 with trembling fingers. I explained the situation to the operator, my voice barely above a whisper, as I described the unsettling events unfolding in our supposedly empty house. The operator urged me to stay calm and advised me to leave the house immediately. But something inside me compelled me to stay and confront whatever, or whoever, was lurking somewhere in my house. Not very bright, I know, but I wasn't thinking properly at this time. Gathering my courage, I crept upstairs, my heart pounding in my ears with each step. As I reached the top, I saw a fleeting shadow dart across the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Suddenly, a dark figure emerged from the darkness, brandishing a gleaming kitchen knife. My blood ran cold as I let out a piercing scream, turning on my heels and fleeing down the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me. I burst through the front door just as the police arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the darkness. 2 officers were already entering the house as I was running out. Breathless and shaken, I recounted the terrifying ordeal to the officers outside, while the others had wasted no time in searching the house from top to bottom. Minutes ticked by like hours as I waited outside, my heart still racing from the adrenaline-fueled encounter. When the officers finally emerged, they assured me that there was no sign of any intruder at all. Confused and shaken, I could hardly believe their words. I told them that he was right behind me. How could he not be there? And how could they explain the footsteps I had heard, the shadowy figure I had seen? But as they left, leaving me alone once again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister lingered within the walls of our home. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, sent my heart pounding. My parents thought I was being dramatic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone in my house. And then one evening, as I sat alone in the dimly lit living room, I stumbled on an old newspaper article tucked away in a forgotten corner of the internet. It detailed the tragic death of a man who had once lived in our house. He had been stabbed to death with a kitchen knife, a man whose restless spirit may still wander the halls of my house at night. I know what I had seen and heard, and it terrified me. I don't know if it was a ghost, but after seeing the article, that was the only other explanation I could come up with.